This meeting is being recorded.
Okay, thank you. I'm here to introduce my good friend, Stacey Jackson. Stacey is mom to Meg, a 21-year-old young woman with intellectual disabilities, and Allison, a high school senior. Stacey and her beautiful family live in Holden, where she served for 9 years on the Wachusett Regional School Committee and led a disability awareness curriculum in the elementary schools. She was an active member of the Special Education Parent Advisory Council, and she volunteered for several years in the Special Education Surrogate Parent Program. She currently serves on the Worcester DDS Citizens Advisory Board. And here's Stacey.
Thank you so much, Gloria, and I'm excited to be here tonight. Thank you guys so much for having me. I am going to go ahead and share my screen, and we will kick things off. Can everyone see the screen okay? Okay. So tonight we just kind of wanted to go over and do an introduction to IEPs, kind of welcome to the world of special education, and talk a little bit about school advocacy. And I know everyone has different roles in your positions, both for CASA and probably day-to-day life as well. So hopefully the information that I share with you will help you to, help provide support for the families that you serve. So feel free to write questions in the chat, stop me halfway through, and I'll definitely be sure to save some room at the end for questions as well. This up. There we go. All right, so first, getting started, how do you qualify for an IEP? So some of your students might not be on IEPs yet. They might need to be on IEPs. So this is kind of, where do we need to start? So the first thing that you need to do to even get into the world of special ed is to request an evaluation. So what you want to do is you want to have a conversation with the school. And again, whatever role you're in, whether, you're encouraging the family to do it or you're working with a DCF social worker to do it, someone needs to request an evaluation. And that request for the evaluation should always be in writing. Pretty much anything you want to do in the world of special ed, you want it in writing because you want to establish a paper trail. And you also, there's a lot of things that depend on timelines. So you want to have everything in writing so that you can see the timelines on that. So when you are requesting an evaluation, you want to make sure to request an evaluation in all the areas that you have concerns for the student. A lot of times people just think in terms of academic challenges. Johnny isn't doing well in math, Johnny can't read. But you want to look at all of the different areas that could be affecting the school environment for this kiddo. Are there social challenges that he or she are facing? Are there behavioral challenges? If there's behavioral challenges, you want to request what's called an FBA, a functional behavioral assessment, to figure out why that student is having behaviors. A lot of those assessments can really look at not only what is the behavior, but what's causing the behavior. Because all behavior, I believe, is a function of communication. The student is communicating something through their behavior. And you have to figure out what are they communicating and what's causing it. What's important when you're looking at behaviors is what's happening right before the behavior. What is triggering that behavior? Is the student overwhelmed? Are there sensory issues? Is there something else going on in the environment that's triggering that behavior? So a really good functional behavioral assessment will look at what's causing the behavior, not just that the child has behavior problems. You want to look at fine motor skills. Are there handwriting issues? Are there, is the student having trouble cutting or manipulating fine things? Look at gross motor skills. Are there issues out on the playground? Are there issues in gym class? Is the child having mobility issues? You want to look at speech and language, not only the output of the speech, but how their receptive language as well and what's coming in. You want to look at any assistive technology. There can be an assistive technology evaluation to look at, does the student need an iPad to communicate? Does the student need an app on their phone to help them, manage their time better. There's just so many areas that a child could have deficits in. So when you're requesting an evaluation, you want to really look at all of those areas of concern and not just the academic areas. Once you send in that request to evaluate, the school is going to send back a form that you have to sign saying, yes, I give authorization to evaluate. And again, this would be either the parent or DCF or the legal guardian who would have to sign that form. You should return that form as quick as possible. So you should get it within 5 school days. If you don't get it within 5 school days, then it's time to ping the school and just say, hey, I'm waiting on that form. I'd like to get it signed as quick as possible. Because then once that form is signed, then the clock starts ticking for the school. And they have 30 school days to do the evaluation and all of the evaluations, whatever evaluations are needed. And then a total of 45 days, so another 15 days to schedule a meeting to review those evaluations. What happens now in the springtime is those deadlines, those timeframes take forever, because if someone were to request something now, you think about, we have a week off in February, we probably have a bunch of snow days coming up, more snow days, and then another week off in April. So these timelines can really spread out when you have a lot of school vacations as well. So it's always good to request evaluations whenever you feel like there's a need, just because the process can take a long time to go through all the evaluations and the meetings. And then you should also make sure to ask for, again, the parent or the guardian to get the evaluations at least 2 days in advance of the meetings. There are some schools that will like to just show the evaluations as someone's walking into an IEP meeting. And that really is not fair. It doesn't give the family, the guardian, the care team enough time to really digest that information, look at the recommendations that are on there, and really, be in a good position to discuss it with the team. So it's always good to request those evaluations at least 2 days in advance of the meeting. If you don't get them, you can postpone the meeting. I've been in situations where, for my own daughter, we've been having IEP meetings since she was 3 years old. So we've been to quite a lot of meetings now. And there have been times where it's the night before and I don't have the evaluation. And I send an email out saying, I know everyone reserved this time. Everyone's time is valuable, but I'm not in a position to be a good team member. So we need to postpone. And that's perfectly within your right to do, because everyone needs to be an active member of the team, and that includes the family or guardians. Once the evaluations are complete, the team will go through what's called the eligibility flow chart. And this is a number of questions that are asked to determine whether or not an IEP is appropriate. So the first question is, does the student have a disability? And there's quite a number of different disability categories. Something like ADHD counts as other health concerns. So ADHD is a qualifying disability. Some schools might tell you otherwise, but it is. Then the next question is the student making effective progress in school? And again, effective progress looks at everything. It's not just academics. Sometimes the school team will say, well, Johnny's getting straight A's, therefore he doesn't need an IEP. That's not true, because Johnny might be getting straight A's, but Johnny might have some social emotional concerns. Johnny might have some behavioral concerns. So just because a student is doing well academically does not mean they're truly making effective progress, because effective progress should be in all different areas. Then the team needs to determine, is the lack of progress a result of their disability? And in a lot of cases it is, but there will be some cases that it might not be, especially some of the students that you serve. They might have a lot of school absences. They might, they have a lot of things going on in their lives. So that question really needs to be looked at. And again, a lot of times a lack of progress is a result of the disability, but not always. There could be extenuating circumstances with different kiddos. And then the last question is, does the student require specially designed instruction in order to make effective progress? And this is looking at, does the student need something different than what all of the other students are getting? And this kind of looks at modifications versus accommodations. So an accommodation is something that you're just changing the way the student might be evaluated or the way the student might get the information, but they're still held to the same grade level curriculum standards. So an accommodation might be that the student might need to sit in the front of the class, or the student might need extra time on a test, or the student might not have to complete as many test questions, but they're still doing the same grade level curriculum. However, there are other students that need modification. And this is where we're taking the information that's given and giving different information. So for example, my daughter has intellectual disabilities. She was never able to do grade level curriculum. She needed for someone to modify that curriculum. So rather than give her 8th grade history, whatever all of the other students were getting, we had to change that a little bit, and we had to put it at a level that she could understand. So that was a modification. She wasn't getting the grade level curriculum. She was getting what was appropriate for her level of functioning. So that's the main difference between modifications and accommodations. So then it comes down to, does the student need an IEP versus a 504? So a 504 is for a student who just needs those accommodations. They just need extra time on a test. They might need, the test in multiple choice rather than, fill in the blank. But again, they're at grade level curriculum. But the IEP is more for the modifications to the curriculum. They need someone to design instruction just for them. Or they need direct services. They need a speech therapist to work with them. They need a special ed teacher to work with them. They need an ABA therapist to work with them. So they need direct services. When in doubt, you always want to push for the IEP, because the IEP is going to be a lot more robust. The IEP has a lot of procedural safeguards, and there's progress reporting of the IEP. So a lot of times schools will recommend, well, let's start with a 504 and see how they do. If you can't get an IEP, definitely start with the 504 because it's better than nothing. But you really need to push for the IEP, because the IEP really holds people a lot more accountable. And again, the progress reporting is very, very important. With a 504, the student's given accommodations and you hope the schools are following them, and you just kind of hope for the best. Whereas with an IEP, it's a document that's outlining who's doing what, how often, and it needs to be reported how well the student is doing. So the IEP is going to be a lot more robust. So again, if you have the choice, really push for an IEP, but depending on the situation, at least get a 504 as the minimum. So when you go to an IEP meeting, it's 1 million people in a room typically. Typically, it's kind of the family sits on one side and all of the school people sit on the other side. And it can be very, very intimidating because it always seems like the school people have a lot of people, and it can be very overwhelming. So there are some people who have to be at the meeting. So the parent or guardian, if the parent is not involved, then the DCF social worker should be there, and or the special ed surrogate parent. If the child is assigned one, they should be there. There should be a special education teacher there. If the student is receiving or is expected to receive any regular education, then a regular ed teacher should be there as well. There should be someone from the district who is a decision maker, because you don't want to have an IEP meeting where everyone talks about the services that the student needs, and then they say, yeah, well, we need to go talk to our boss, or we need to talk to the principal. There should be someone in that room who's able to make any decisions that need to be made. And usually that's the team chair who's kind of running the meeting and keeping everyone on track. Anyone who has completed an evaluation should be there. If they cannot be there, there should be a representative who can review the test data. So someone knowledgeable with testing and evaluation should be there, but really it should be the person who has done the evaluation. Students are invited once they turn age 14. They are definitely invited. I encourage students to go much younger. With my own daughter, we started having her go to meetings. I think she was in 4th or 5th grade, and she didn't sit at the whole meeting, but it was good for her to come in at the very beginning, just kind of introduce herself. We explained, this is your team. They are all here to support you. What do you want them to know? And it's been remarkable over the last several years. She's brought up things that I never would have thought of. And also we've been in meetings where the principal or the assistant principal is a lot more accommodating to her than they would if I asked the same question. And I think it's really good for student self-advocacy to be involved in those meetings. So like I said, the law says they have to be invited once they're at age 14. I encourage younger, but again, they don't need to be there for the whole meeting. You know, part of the meeting, you're talking about the students' challenges. They don't necessarily need to hear all that. So just have them in for part of the meeting if it's appropriate and if they're able to do that. And then anyone else who has knowledge of the child is welcome to go to that meeting. So, you know, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, ministers, coaches, anyone is welcome. I always encourage, give the school a heads up if other people are going to be coming in, just so they have enough chairs, just so they have, you know, they expect you, but anyone is welcome who has knowledge of that child. And it's great for everyone to see that it is a team and there's lots of people supporting the student. If there are people on the required list of attendees who cannot be there or need to leave early, it does need to be approved by the parent or guardian to let them out of the meeting. You know, we've been in meetings, oh, Mrs. Smith has bus duty. You know, is it okay? Do you excuse her? Most of the time it's fine. Sometimes there are people that are critical to the meeting and you don't want to excuse them. And then you can say, nope, I'd rather reschedule because Mrs. Smith has really important information that I think the whole team needs to hear. So that's okay to say, nope, we need to reschedule. Schools do not like to reschedule meetings because it takes a lot of resources away from students. So they will usually be accommodating if they understand that you have a hard line of requiring them to have people at the table that should be there. A lot of times schools will plan meetings to last an hour. I know at my meetings, an hour was never long enough. We've had several hour meetings and we've gone several hours and we have not been done. So we've said, okay, we'll reschedule next week or the week after. That's okay. It's going to take as long as it takes. And it's going to take as long as everyone feels comfortable with establishing a plan that's going to support the student well. So don't feel like you have a time frame. Don't feel like you need to end at an hour. It's going to take as long as it takes. And once you get in there, there's a lot of ground to cover. So that's why sometimes it does take a while, because you're reviewing any assessments and recommendations from those assessments. You're outlining the needs of the student. You're developing the IEP, which is a very lengthy document, and you're outlining the exact services, how often those services are going to be needed, and you're talking about placement. So there's a lot of things to discuss at those meetings. So they could take a while. When you're developing the IEP, you always want to start with the vision and the concerns. And I always encourage families and team members to articulate these in advance. I know myself, I like to send them by email at least a week in advance to everyone on the team so that they know where I'm coming from. They know what my concerns are, so that when they're starting to think about goals and objectives and services, They already know what I'm looking for. The other thing that's really important is to look at a long-term vision for the student. A friend of mine had a great analogy that each your child's progress in school is like a cross-country trip. So you're trying to get your kiddo from Massachusetts to California. Each IEP meeting is really only pushing them to the next state. You know, that you're starting off in Massachusetts, they're only looking to get you to Connecticut. But the family needs to think about, how are we getting to California? So someone really needs to have a good long-term vision for the student. So rather than worry about, all right, we need to get Johnny from a 3rd grade level to a 4th grade level. Well, let's stop and think, where do we want Johnny to be 5 years from now? And what are the deficits that we see that Johnny's going to have 5 years from now? And what can we put in place now to start working towards those? We're not going to solve it right away, but we need to start making incremental steps so that we can realize our long-term vision. So it's really important to start with that, with the IEP team, of understanding, not only what are the immediate concerns that we have now, but where are we looking to go long-term and what can we put in place to get there? One of the big pieces on IEPs are goals and objectives. And this is an area that a lot of people struggle with, not only the school team, but families as well, because you know the overall goal is you want Susie to do better in math. But goals need to be challenging, measurable, and understandable to anyone reading it. So you can't just put, I want Susie to have grade level math skills. Well, what does that mean? And my idea of what that means might be different than the next person. We really want to narrow down what exactly are those skills that we're looking for, and where are we looking for Susie to be? Do we want her to be at 100% of, mastery of her math skills? Is 80% okay? And you really need to look at it on a case-by-case basis. Going to all these workshops, the one thing that they throw out is something like, you need to make sure the goals make sense. Susie can cross the street safely 80% of the time. Well, that doesn't make sense because that other 20% is catastrophic. So you have to really look at each goal and look at what makes sense. But the most important thing is to make sure it's measurable, because if it's not measurable, you really have no idea if the student is making any progress. And data is critical to the IEP team. You need to understand, you need to first have data, and then you need to understand the data to know if the student is making progress or not. We'll talk more about that in another slide. So IEPs, once they are developed, they need to be signed by the parent, the guardian, the special ed surrogate parent. Sometimes schools at the end of the meeting will hit print and put something in front of the parent or guardian. Here you go, ready to sign. No. Nothing needs to be signed that day. In fact, I really discourage it because these are lengthy documents. My daughter's is about 30 pages long. It takes me a long time just to read it the first time. But then really what you want to do is you want to compare any new IEP to any previous IEP. Literally go through page by page. It takes a very long time because I've seen schools change things. Not mention it to the family, but, oh, gee, the kid lost transportation, or, oh, gee, they took away speech therapy. It was never really disclosed. But unless you're really comparing last year's IEP to this year's IEP page by page, you're not going to notice that. So sometimes IEP teams will write up the notes at the end of the meeting, and they'll want parents to sign that that's what was agreed upon. If the meeting went well and you generally agree with what everything was said, you can initialize the note pages. I've had some contentious meetings where I've signed it and have just said, I'm signing that I received this note page, not that I agree with it. So again, you don't need to feel obligated to sign anything, and definitely you want to really look at that IEP really well. If it's a first IEP, You never, ever, ever want to reject it totally. Because with any IEP, whether it's the first IEP or subsequent IEPs, you want to try to accept something in it. Because if you reject it, then you have no new goals that you're working on. And especially if it's your first IEP, if you reject it, they're not giving the student any services. So you want to try to accept something that you agree on just to get the ball rolling and get some services started. And another important issue is when you're looking at IEPs, subsequent IEPs going forward, using stay put rights. This is probably the most important right that the family or guardian has, in that if a school comes to you and says, oh, the student's doing great, they don't need IEP services anymore, or they don't need speech therapy or physical therapy or any services, we can remove that. Families and guardians have the right to use what's called stay put. And the family says, no, I don't agree. And while we're discussing how we're going to resolve this dispute, the student will continue to get services. So you just need to remember that no one can take a kid off an IEP, no one can remove services unless the family or guardian agrees to it, because they can use stay put rights to keep those services in place while they're resolving the IEP. So that's one of the most important rights that the family and guardians have, is to use those stay put rights. So how to ensure students are getting what they should get? And in this day and age, school staffs are so thin, and there's so many open teacher positions, there's so many open positions for paraprofessionals, that we know students aren't always getting what they should get. So the most important thing for families, guardians, support personnel is to just ask questions. And I love playing stupid and just asking a lot of questions and asking for clarification, because in doing that, you get a lot of really good information. So the most important question is to find out, if the student does have an IEP, are they getting the services that are outlined on the service delivery grid? And, definitely ask the school that. They might tell you, no, Mrs. Smith, the occupational therapist has been out for months. Well, we need to figure out what's going on there. One of the most important ways that you can find this information is to just ask the student, hey, Johnny, I know you're supposed to see Miss Susie, your physical therapist, once a week. Have you seen her since Christmas? Kids tell you, they know if they've seen a person or not. It's really important to ask. And then if they say, no, I haven't seen her in a while, then you can follow up with the school and say, hey, it seems like Johnny isn't getting his physical therapy. I've gone so far as to ask for logs recording when my child has gotten services. And sure enough, I found out that she had not. So then I could ask for compensatory services of, okay, you were supposed to be providing the service once a week. You didn't do that for 2 months. How are you going to make up for that time? And that's well within your right to ask. Right now, with so many staff absences, it's important to understand what happens when the staff is absent. I know in our district, a lot of times, they're grouping students together. So a student should have a one-on-one paraprofessional or ABA therapist. It's not happening. They're being put in small groups of 2 and 3 students. So you need to understand what's going on there and let the team know, I don't understand how that's possible, because it says here in the IEP that Johnny gets one-to-one services. So how is that happening? And again, you're just kind of asking those questions, but you're also letting the school know that you're on to them and that you're watching out for the student. Because the schools, a lot of times, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. If someone is looking out for the student and they know that someone's looking out for them, that student's going to get better services than someone whose family or guardian are not asking those questions. It's really important to understand from the school's point of view is, what do they feel the student's strengths are? And how can the team focus on those? It's so important that these students, while they might have a lot of deficits, they have so many strengths, and you can use those strengths to their advantage. Yes, they might struggle in one area, but they can use that benefit to their advantage. My daughter has a great memory, and she can't understand how to do long division, but she's got a great memory. So let's have her memorize skills, different facts and things like that. So you have to use the student's strength to their advantage whenever possible. And as we talked about earlier, the data is so important. So students on IEPs get progress reports as often as typical students get report cards. So if regular kids or typical kids are getting report cards 4 times a year, you're going to get 4 progress reports for a kid on an IEP. Those progress reports should have data because the goals and objectives should be data driven. The student is going to do this 80% of the time. Well, if the progress report comes back and just says, Johnny is making progress, that's not data. You need to go back to the school and say, okay, the objective says 80% of the time. Is Johnny at 50% of the time or 90% of the time? And you need that data. And then you really need to look at that data over time to really look at the trends. Years ago, my daughter's school, when she was little, kept telling me, oh, she's making progress in her reading. She's progressing. But I took a look at the data that I got on the progress reports, and they measure, all the sight words, how many words she could read, and I graphed it, and it was a flat line. And while they kept telling me she was making progress, the data showed it was a flat line. So you can really see trends there when you really start looking at that data over time. And if a student is not showing progress, then the IEP is not effective. It needs to be changed. Because if an IEP is appropriate, the student's going to make progress. So if they're not making progress, there's a problem, and that needs to be addressed. Finding out which staff members have which responsibilities are really important. There are some phenomenal paraprofessionals out there, some on this call. And a lot of times paraprofessionals are modifying curriculum. Technically, only certified teachers should be doing that. So the fact that the school is having other people do that, that's not right. That's not what they're being paid for. That's not what they should be spending time doing. So again, you really need to look at who's in charge in what areas and who has which responsibilities and really understand that. And then the most important way to ask these questions is to try to get teachers and school staff on their own, outside the IEP meeting. I have gotten my best information from teachers and school staff from hallway meetings, from pickup times, picking up at the end of the day or dropping off in the morning, because a lot of times at IEP meetings, a lot of the school staff are kind of told, don't say certain things. Let's not bring up the fact that Johnny needs more services because we don't have more services to give him, or our speech therapist already has too many kids on her caseload. But if you can talk to a teacher in a more informal setting and just ask them, how's Johnny doing? What do you feel like Johnny needs? Is there anything that you feel like I should ask for as a support person, as a parent or guardian? That information is gold, because again, a lot of that information, a lot of the teachers are told, don't say it out loud in an IEP meeting. So if you can have any sort of private conversation, that's usually where you're going to get a lot of really good information. And then what I like to call the common school statements. And these are things that I think every family has probably heard at one time or another. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of these in your work with the students. A lot of schools, you'll ask for something. Oh, we have a policy against that. They're just making it up most of the time. I've been in this position. I said, oh, you have a policy. Is it a school committee policy? Can you show me where on the website I should go to find that? And then when you ask those questions, of course, no one has a really good answer because the policy does not exist. They like to claim the student is doing so well, they don't need an IEP anymore. Well, again, you need to go back. Where's the data to prove it? First of all, you need data to show that the student is now at grade level or age appropriate level or no longer has a deficit in an area. But the other important part with that is the student still accessing those services? So, okay, the student's now at grade level, but they're getting an hour of special education every single day. Well, what's going to happen when they don't get that hour? And how can the school team predict that it will be fine? Nobody knows. So what I recommend in those situations is tell the school, okay, I'm in general agreement with that, but let's try pulling back. Let's keep the IEP. We're not going to change the IEP. Let's try pulling back on those services while keeping the IEP and see what happens. Because once you lose those services, it's next to impossible to get back. And again, if you disagree with removing those services, you have those stay put rights to keep what you have going. A lot of schools will say students on grade level, so they don't need an IEP, or we don't want to label them. I love that one. That's my favorite. If a student is on grade level, what are the other areas of needs? And again, in the beginning, we talked about there's so many other areas of needs that are not just academic, so you need to look at that. And we don't want to label the student. Well, if a student is struggling, they're going to show it. They're going to show it through their behavior, through their actions, through their mental health. So whether or not a kid is on an IEP or not, the kid still has needs. So whether or not you label them, it doesn't matter. But at least by getting them on an IEP and giving them the services, you're giving them a way to meet those needs. Schools will say, we don't do that here. We don't have that. And again, we need to remember that the I in IEP is individualized. And just because it's never been done before doesn't mean it can't be done. The other thing that the schools like to do a lot is to put students with needs in a special classroom, in a special school, and segregate them, like it's 1950. We don't do that anymore, and it shouldn't be done. Students should only be removed from a regular education classroom if you've already tried to give them supports and services. That includes a one-to-one paraprofessional. You need to give them everything, every opportunity to succeed in that regular education classroom or school before you remove them to a more restrictive environment. So that's something, the schools like to do because it's easier for everyone to just have a group of kids with special needs all in the same classroom. They could have one teacher. But the problem is those classrooms typically just kind of aim towards the bottom. And there aren't those high expectations that you have in the regular education classroom. So it's very important to always try to keep kids in the regular education classroom as much as possible. There are some students that doesn't work for them. They have sensory needs, they have other needs that they need a more restrictive environment, and that's fine too. But when in doubt, they should always be put in the regular education classroom as much as possible. But again, with those supports given in regular ed, rather than just putting them in a different classroom or a different school. So a couple of the more specific things that your kiddos are probably facing is transferring schools. When a kid goes to a new school district with an IEP, the receiving school should be providing the same services in a comparable setting until they can develop a new IEP. So if a kid comes from Wachusett in an ABA classroom with a one-to-one ABA therapist and moves to Worcester, they should have a similar environment like that until a new IEP is developed. Worcester, for example, could meet and say, oh, we think we can meet this kid's needs in regular ed or whatever, and then it becomes a discussion. But the initial starting point is to keep them with what they had before. And with a lot of the students that you serve, some of the students can be defined as homeless per the McKinney-Vento. So what happens there is students would have the right to remain in their original school that they were attending and receive transportation services. So for example, a student starts off in Shrewsbury and then moves to Worcester. They can get transportation from Worcester to Shrewsbury through McKinney-Vento, or they could move to Worcester schools. And this really needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. You need to look at, was the old school working for the student? Did they have good services there? Is the student settled there? Or would the new school be a better environment? Would they have, better support there? Does the student just need a fresh start and a change? So that really needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. But for kids that are in this situation, it's nice that they have the option of either remaining at the old school and getting transportation there, or moving to a new school. So again, should be looked at, definitely case-by-case basis, to look at both what are the schools offering and what kind of support that they can give, as well as how is it going to impact the student to move to a different school, and each kiddo is going to be different. Student discipline comes up a lot with a number of kiddos on IEPs. So if a student is removed from school for more than 10 days, and this is either consecutively or cumulative, it could be one day a month. Once it adds up to 10, the school needs to make sure that they are continuing to provide a free and appropriate public education, and that the student receives their IEP services, and they're continuing to work towards those goals. So a lot of times it's easy if a student has out of school suspension, they're not there. That counts. A lot of schools try to circumvent it a little bit and give a call. Oh, Johnny's having trouble with his behavior today. He needs to be picked up. That's change in placement. Johnny's not at school all day because the school said he can't be at school all day. So a day like that counts towards those 10 days. And a lot of times schools won't really want to count those. It does count. In-school suspension counts as well. Johnny's not in Mrs. Smith's second grade classroom if he's sitting in the principal's office all day. That's a change in placement. So once you get up to those 10 days, again, consecutively or cumulatively, then a manifestation determination needs to happen. And you really need to look at, is whatever problem behavior happening because of the disability? If it's happening because of the disability, then the IEP is not addressing that issue, and you need different services on that IEP. If it's not a manifestation of the disability, if it's happening for a different reason, the student still needs to receive a free and appropriate public education. There are special circumstances that the schools will look at. If it's an issue of weapons or drugs or things like that, the schools could put the kids in an alternate placement. But again, that's on a case-by-case basis. But you also really need to look at, is the disability impacting that? A friend of mine has a daughter who's on the autism spectrum. She brought a knife to school. And at first, everyone freaked out. Oh my God, she had a knife at school. Then they asked her, why did she have a knife at school? Mom gives me an apple for lunch every day. I can't cut it with the plastic knife at school. She has autism. She doesn't understand how people might perceive that knife as threatening. So you need to understand the reason behind the behaviors. And again, it's just so important, because behavior is communication. You need to understand what the kiddo is communicating. So I wanted to provide some resources here. When in doubt, I always love to go to the law. Massachusetts law is a little better than the federal law. So when in doubt, use the Massachusetts law, and that will trump the federal law in Massachusetts. Wright's Law is a phenomenal resource. It's kind of my go-to when I have a question for everything. It's run by a gentleman, Peter Wright. He's a special ed attorney. He's been a special ed attorney for years and years, and Wright's Law is just a wealth of information. The Federation for Children with Special Needs is a nonprofit run out of Boston. You can call them anytime. They have advocates that are answering the phones, happy to answer any questions. They're a great resource. They also have a yearly conference. It's been virtual the past few years. I've gone to it since Meg was 3 years old, I think. A lot of good information on there. The DESE problem resolution system, this used to be called PQA, it's now PRS. If a student has an IEP and you know the IEP is not being followed, the school is not doing a good job, first step is to always try to work with the school and seek resolution that way. If you're still unsuccessful that way, anyone can file a complaint through DESE PRS. You file a complaint about what's going on, how the school is not meeting it. DESE will investigate. They'll send a note out to the school and just say, what have you got to say for yourself, and what are you going to do to resolve this situation? So that's been a really effective way of ensuring that schools are being held accountable. And then there's a lot of special ed parent advisory groups and other special ed groups. A lot of them are on Facebook. So there's a lot of good information on there. Wachusett has a great special ed parent page that we welcome anyone from any district. And it's just a great resource. People can put on questions either with their own name, or they can do anonymous questions asking anything. And parents have done it all, been through it all, seen it all. So there's a lot of great information and a lot of great networking on there. So thank you so much. I know that was a lot of information thrown at you, but I am happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
Thanks, Stacey. I was thinking, Stacey, I was remembering when you talked about combing through the paperwork of my copy when I worked with Meg it was highlighted and no one was allowed to touch it.
But that brings up an important thing, is to make sure that school staff, the important school staff that are working with the student, get a copy of the IEP, because that's not always automatically done. I
had to ask for it. It was given freely. Like I was kind of an afterthought, but I was like, I need that. That was our little roadmap every day.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Stacey. It looks like we have a few questions that were dropped into the chat during the presentation. The first one that I'm seeing is from Bruce, and it says, does the CASA ask for this evaluation normally? I think this is the evaluation that you were talking about towards the beginning of your presentation.
Yep. So I think according to the law, I think it has to officially come from either the parent or guardian. But you could encourage them to do that, and you can even kind of write it for them, but really encourage them to do that. Yeah, I don't think the CASA would officially be able to ask for that, but you could definitely give support around that.
Thank you.
The next one I see is from Jeff. Does an IEP require a technical diagnosis of the disability?
No, it doesn't. So the schools will say we're not allowed to diagnose, but they know if a student is struggling and a student needs the services, they can get it. The other thing is, if the schools try to push back, the parent doesn't need a $5,000 neuropsych or outside testing or anything like that. A pediatrician could write something and diagnose a student with ADHD or whatever other challenges that they have. But you don't need the official one. Liz, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I'm someone who gives evaluations to students for special education. And usually the language that we use in our reports is the student meets like the educational qualifications for ADHD or anxiety or whatever that may be. So it's like within the school setting. So we're not like medically diagnosing, but within the school, they can get what they need with that language.
Yep, she's related to me.
Yeah.
All right, and the next question I see is from Tim. He said, I am interested to understand who fills the role of guardian for an IEP when a child is in foster care. Is it DCF, the foster parent, or someone else?
So typically in the cases that I've been involved with, I've served as a surrogate parent. So in that case, I would have signing privileges. If a surrogate parent is not involved, then typically I believe the DCF social worker would be the legal guardian, but I don't know if anyone else has experience with that.
Yeah, I know that DCF can sign. I think it's kind of looked to the foster parent to be a part of that meeting as well. I used to work for DCF, and I'm trying to think back to when I would sit in on those meetings if biological parents were signing or what their involvement was. Lynn, do you have any info on that? If you're listening. She might not be. That's okay.
I've had conflicting experiences with this. In the first one, the children were in a group home, and DCF said unequivocally they could not be the decision maker. They could not sign the IEP, and as a consequence, there was a surrogate assigned, which was a fantastic experience once the surrogate was involved. With my current case, I hear some confusing things from DCF where they say that they're in charge, but they can't sign the IEP. So I don't understand.
It is interesting because when you're DCF and you hold custody of that child, you would assume that that worker or, someone within the office would have that right, so to say. But you're right, there is a lot of conflicting answers about that question.
And I see that on the active IEP right now, it was a former foster parent, not the current foster parent, but a former foster parent who signed.
Okay. I can do some more digging, Tim, as well, if you would like.
So I don't deal with IEPs. I work for early intervention, so I deal with IFSPs. But my experience is the same as was just said. DCF will not sign our family plans. They will have the foster family sign it. And in the cases where I've had kids in group homes, there have been educational surrogates.
Thank you. All right.
Excellent information.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You would think as a supervisor, part of CASA, I would know the answer to that. But oftentimes
The one thing I've learned in my 2 IEP experiences is it's a very complicated process.
It is. I
And
feel like
whenever we think we know, something else pops up
Yeah.
that's new.
Yeah.
That does lead to my other question, though. My experience with the education surrogate parent was very good. That person was excellent. And I wonder if anyone has advice on how we as CASA can push, my current case that doesn't involve a group home. So the foster parent, I think, is supposed to sign it. And I just think that situation isn't going to result in the best outcome for the child. So my question is, any advice on how to advocate or request a surrogate parent?
If I remember correctly from the past, I think that there's an organization that can be reached out to kind of start that process. I'm sure DCF would have to come into play to get all of the approval for all of those things since they do hold custody of the child. But I'm under the impression that they can, you can reach out to that person, or I'm even thinking maybe the child's attorney through court or something of that sort, since they can do the court as well.
I had a recent case, the attorney just stepped right in. They pushed something through the high school and the manifestation, he didn't have representation, and the attorney was fantastic. The child's attorney just took right over. And I guess the first step is, if you haven't already, let's get it in our report in front of the judge that we recommend it,
All right, do we have any other questions or comments from anyone? No.
Yeah, I got one. All my questions are beginner kind of questions, so bear with me for those of you who know more about what you're doing than I do, which is just about everybody. So we said that a parent or guardian is the one who can request the IEP. Who is the one that does the IEP? And I know you probably put it out, but I'm absorbing all this stuff and I probably missed it.
So the parent or guardian would request an evaluation and then be involved in the meeting when the evaluations are reviewed.
Okay.
And then if they determine that the student has a disability, is not making effective progress, and needs specially designed instruction, then then the whole team, both the school team and the parent or guardian, would develop the IEP. And then the parent or guardian would sign the IEP to say that, yes, we consent to this child receiving these services.
So they would, the group would create the IEP. Is that the same group or a similar group that got together with a lot of people in the beginning to discuss? Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so some schools do it differently. Some schools will develop a draft IEP and kind of present it at the meeting of, look, we have a draft IEP, it's all ready to go. And then other schools will really go through the painstaking process of developing it in the meeting with, you know, a dozen people in the room. So the schools do it differently, but the family or guardian should definitely have a lot of input into it.
And where does early intervention insert into this?
So early intervention would go up until the child is 3 years old.
Okay.
And then typically there's a transition meeting where the early intervention people would meet with the school district, usually the preschool group, and basically kind of transition the child from early intervention to the preschool program. So they would do like an exit evaluation to say, okay, you know, this child that's turning 3 has these needs in the areas of, you know, cognitive, academic, social, emotional, behavioral, motor skills. And then they would kind of feed all that information into the preschool, and then the preschool would develop an IEP for the student.
So, and also that early intervention person could decide, or that early intervention group could decide that the child is not in need of a IEP and therefore it's just left alone to evaporate or whatever.
So if their evaluation at right when the child is turning 3 shows that the child is at age level for all those different skills, they could make a recommendation that no services are needed.
Okay.
And then it would be up to the family to say, no, let's start with the school district and have them do evaluations and see if the school district evaluations show that there are any needs for the student.
So then Tim's question then, or Tim's comments then come into play with, if it's a foster placement and the foster is not the parent or guardian, and then neither is DCF, then this is where he's suggesting that a surrogate parent or a surrogate, I forget the term, surrogate parent?
Yeah, so it would be a special ed surrogate parent would be assigned.
Okay.
And that person would be there to advocate for the student, work on development of the IEP, and have signing privileges.
So that person gets assigned by DCF?
Technically, it's assigned, it goes through the Federation for Children with Special Needs, but I think DCF has to request it, although I don't know all the details that happened in the background.
Okay. That's it for my
I've seen
beginning.
some of the cases, some of the judges will appoint someone and they know someone, you know, in their professional pool that they draw from, they'll appoint one as well. But we probably would have to push for it through DCF on our end.
Okay. Thank you for letting me put my training wheels on.
No problem.
Excellent questions. It's all good. All really good, Bruce.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments from anyone?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Linda, so how early can a child receive an IEP? Would it be in pre-K when he's in an actual formal school setting? Or would it be, in other words, as early as pre-K, or would it go, he could go into kindergarten? Like how early can that begin?
It can start at age 3. So an IEP can go from age 3 to age 22.
Oh, okay. So technically my child probably already has one and nobody's told me about it.
That could be a possibility.
That happens a lot, Linda.
Yeah. All right. Thank you. Any other questions before we get off of here? Comment.
How does that happen? How does she have a child and is not aware of the existence of an IEP?
Well, it's really just the chase of information. I'm her supervisor on this case, just hearing from people, hearing back from people, getting all of the details about all of the things.
Well, I know that he was evaluated. He was evaluated before he went into pre-K, but I don't know what the outcome of that is. And I wasn't sure that I was, since I wasn't included in any of the meetings, I didn't realize that that was something I could have. But apparently it is, or is it? Like,
It is.
can I call up his school tomorrow? And who would I ask for it?
Yeah, Linda, I can talk through that process with you. I can help you get a hold of it.
Okay, thank you.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I think I am going to just respect the timing of this. I know we're a little bit over an hour, so I'm probably going to put an end so that everyone can get to their evenings. But Stacey, thank you so, so much for your knowledge,
Outstanding,
your time.
outstanding.
It was wonderful.
Thank you.
This is a subject that I feel like we just can't learn enough about.
So can
we
I just
really-
add, we've talked to Stacey about doing a part 2 towards the fall.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yes.
Yep.
So yeah,
Anytime.
that's definitely on the talk schedule.
Yes.
Sounds good.
We will keep you all up to date. We have her PowerPoints and her resources. If any of you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to either Glorianne and I, and we can help you figure out the answer. But again, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Oh,